Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of AdvoChats. So we're joined by Dhananath Fernando and Udahiruni Atapattu today. And in terms of content today, we'll be looking to talk about the recently imposed minimum hotel room rates. And on top of that, we'd also like to do a bit of catch up and a bit of news roundup about things that happen locally and globally as well, and to see how those things play out in Sri Lanka and how those things might affect us as citizens and the rational purchaser. So the first big thing, guys, I think we should talk about is the Exim Bank accepting our debt restructuring proposal, at least in principle. Now, to shed a bit of light onto this, it approximately covers about 4.2 billion of outstanding US debt that we owe to the Export-Import Bank of China, and it was something that was kind of holding back the IMF when it came to discussing the second tranche of 333 million, if I'm not mistaken, and figuring out how the rest of our bilateral creditors would look in terms of restructuring their debt as well. And I think this is a pivotal moment, right?
Absolutely, Akhila. I think it's a positive indication in terms of the debt restructuring way forward, because we have been, everyone was concerned what would be the future of the debt restructuring, especially of course, with the geopolitical tensions and how would China react. So I think Exim Bank agreeing, at least in principle, is a positive indication. We really do not know what's the agreement is. So we have to wait and see. I think President is also planning to visit China in the coming weeks. So let's be hopeful, but it's a critical step in terms of the external debt restructuring, and hope everything would be fine. But there are risk factors, as we all know. China is a key creditor for a lot of emerging markets. So whatever the treatment that they provide, that will have an impact on rest of the other countries as well.
So I spoke about the second IMF tranche of 33 million, and it was something that was called off, or at least delayed within the last month, if I'm not mistaken. And one of those reasonings was that, at least according to a report they put out, it's the diagnostics governance analysis, if I'm not mistaken. And in that, I believe Dhananath and Udahiruni, they spoke of SOA reformations and how, yes, Sri Lanka has started processes of divestitures and setting up the law required to perhaps privatize them, or just how make these things profitable and less of a burden on the state and our debt as a whole. In recent news, I think today it was brought out, the whole immunoglobulin vaccine and the back and forth that's being played by the NMRA as well as the Ministry of Health. So, not to go into details about the complexities of it, but I think it showed us a glaring issue that we currently have within our systems, is that there's a lack of governance within these SOEs, right? In a way that there's accountability for both the public, and also there's a huge social cost as well when we look at the deliverance of this medication, and how time and time again, I think within the last year as well, we had issues of substandard medication being given to the public. Also at subsidized rates. And not only is this affecting our debt issues, but it's also affecting our public, and it's quite harmful in my eyes. And now, if anyone has, any of you guys read the news on it, it's the ball's being passed around, right? The NMRA says they never gave a waiver, and the Ministry of Finance says, no, look, we have it, and now it's an issue of it being whether it's authentic or not. And at the end of the day, if you want to talk about accountability, right, in most other governing systems where you have a Westminster, something that models a Westminster parliamentary system, the moment something like this would have happened, you would notice the minister responsible, if there's individual responsibility, that he would have stepped down. Or if you want to look at it in a very puritanical way, collective responsibility have kicked in, and the government then should have stepped down. But what we saw was that a no confidence motion was brought up against the current Minister of Health, and that was failed, right? And I think this just speaks to, once again, to the IMF report about how our governance structures are still not in place. And even though we talk and tout about economic stability, I think it goes hand in hand to talk about economic stability as well as political stability, as social stability as well. What are your opinions, Udahiruni?
Yes, Akhila.
So Akhila, sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
No, please, Dana, go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry, I jumped the gun.
No, I was going to say, so like you said, there's a bit of confusion, right? As in who is responsible for what. And I think rightfully, like you said, it does raise questions on not just accountability, but also on oversight, because if the regulator of the industry is saying, we don't know what happened, that is a massive concern. And I think sometimes when you talk about SOE reforms, and we also throw around this idea of having a regulator, and also talking about how that might be sort of like a holistic almost solution to some of the problems that are with SOEs. But I think this problem is also highlighting some of the issues with having a regulator, but the regulator not having maybe enough oversight, and also enough oversight, and also being able to hold the responsible party accountable as well, right? And then bringing that back to the IMF report, rightfully, like you said, they have raised a lot of concerns about the state of Sri Lanka's SOE, especially in terms of governance, accountability, transparency, and how that has also led to issues in especially in public investments, and especially in procurement, for example, and that is very, very, like you said, linked to what is currently happening within the healthcare system. So I think we need to sort of, when we look at SOEs, right, I think we have to sort of look at it in a way where I would say, I think, especially when it comes to the current state of where we are with the SOE reforms, right? And we talk about like privatization, we've been talking about it for a very long time now. But we have not really gotten anywhere with it, as highlighted by the IMF report as well. And I think Dhananath, you can add to this as well.
My view is, Akhil, actually, the personal confidence motion could have brought against the NIMRA because these guys lost their database. Can you believe that? Of course, they have multiple issues on that. And generally, as you know, my opinion is, if you want to make it, I mean, if you want to incentivize corruption, what you need to do is make the system very complicated. And I think NMRA is doing it in a grand scale. But it doesn't mean that there hasn't been a regulatory system. But I'm sure everyone who takes an approval on any drug or any medical equipment, I have personally been in some of those, for a research purpose some time ago, and you can see how things work at NMRA. I mean, you need not to be you just go there and check. I mean, there are ways that how the files goes, and I mean, it's common. But the challenge is, Akhil, I think it's easy to talk about governance and all that. I think it's paramount important. But in that current system, there is no point trying to impose governance, because it's such a fractured, there's no system. So when there's no system, it's very difficult to trap you on a governance, bringing the governance and avoid that, because I mean, they are just financing it from the taxpayer money. So even there is no responsibility, even if you import or order the inferior or substandard medicine or vaccines or anything. So I think it's quite sad. But ideally, when you have a better economically sensible system, but it doesn't mean that we have to, I'm not suggesting that privatize or something on the healthcare system, but as we all know, the system doesn't work. I mean, when someone makes a decision on someone else's money, it really doesn't work in that sense. So but I understand the government, it doesn't mean that the minister or whoever should bring it as an excuse in the no confidence motion debate. Look, there's no structure, I am not responsible. That's definitely not the spirit of what I'm saying. They are responsible, they are definitely responsible. It is not an excuse, but in a context that there is no system, and that the NMRA itself has lost their own database, it has very little meaning that you're asking the governance system to come. Even there has to be a system to first to find out like who are the people who are responsible in a proper database. So that's my overall comment, but it doesn't mean that the authorities, I mean, as you know, when you're at a senior level, not having those is not an excuse. You can't say, no, I don't know and all that. Yeah, you are responsible.
Right. Now, that you said something very interesting to me that caught my attention. But before we move on, I just want to remind our audience that we're open for all questions. Anything you guys want to ask us, we'll do our best to answer them at any given point. So keep sending them in to us through the chat boxes, and we'll try and get back to you within our time frame. So now, Dhananath, you said something about the regulator, right? And how the state plays this role of regulating, and you expect there to be a regulation of some sort. So now what I want to talk about was recently, I think now about a couple of weeks ago, the regulator of business in Sri Lanka, for some reason being the state, playing an authoritarian sort of role in the governance and how things play out. They introduced something that really didn't make sense to me. It was a minimum room rate policy. Could you explain to us and the viewers and to me actually what that really entails?
Sure, Akhila. So essentially, a minimum room rate is almost like they've imposed essentially a price control. So what they've told the hotels within the city of Colombo, that you can't sell a room in your hotel below the price that is given by the government, right? And the way they've classified it is by your star level. So if you're a 1-star hotel, it will be $20. That's the minimum, so you can't go below that. If it's 2 stars, it's $35. If it's 3 stars, $60. 4 stars, $75, and 5 stars, $100. So if you're a hotel within this, and if you're a hotel and you fall into the star classification system and you're within the city of Colombo, you can't sell a room below this price, right? And I think this is not also a new policy for us, because we had this from, I believe, 2009 to 2019. Where they imposed this for almost a decade, and the only reason they took it out was after the Easter Sunday attacks, and they wanted to bring in more tourists. So that's essentially how it works. Essentially, it functions as a price control.
Right. Okay. So once again, the state is getting itself involved in like an area that it really shouldn't. Right. We saw the state trying to impose price controls. I think in a lot of things. I think the most recent one, or the one that comes to memory, is I think on eggs, if I'm not mistaken. Where they tried to set a standard, and that also didn't work out. In the end, it just impacted the end consumer because there was a lack of availability of product.
If I may interrupt, you should ask in which sector that the state hasn't intervened in terms of prices. No, just continue. Sorry, I just intervened.
No, I understand. No, that's a law. That's something that we've seen time and time again, the state doing, and to very little fruition, where it doesn't make sense of the state being an arbiter. But for once, I'd like to be on the side of the state for a little bit, because I think there were reports that it was in fact the industry itself that requested for price controls to be set on the star grading. Now, Dhananath, if you, I read something interesting recently in the star grading system that runs in Sri Lanka. Like when you watch pop culture, look at other international systems, when you hear the word 5-star, you expect there to be some sort of indication of service, and this is the apex of the hotel industry. And but recently I learned that in Sri Lanka, the star grade system that we have has very little to do with services and the services you can expect, but it's sort of looked at quantifying things that are quantifiable, such as the size, the floor plan of the rooms, the size of the rooms, the fittings that are available, how good the lifts are, and things like that. Which really, at the end of the day, while they do matter, as a consumer of these products, would you not be more enticed to know that the star grading system is reflective of your experience in terms of service as well?
I also got to know it very recently, Akhila. Apparently, that the star grading system doesn't factor in on the service, the quality of service that you provide, and it's such a surprise for me because hospitality industry itself is driven through services. I mean, you check whether the doorman is smiling with you and whether the reception was accommodative. I mean, those are the little things that generally in service quality that people measure. I mean, even at supermarkets through mystery shopping exercises, they measure so many things like from cleanliness to services becomes key rather than the size of the room and all that, because you can have the largest room in town, but if it's not cleaned, it means very little to have in like the 5-star category. So definitely I think it has to reflect, and sadly it is not. And as a result, I think this price flow has been imposed, and it is sad. When I tweeted, actually I think some people have basically mentioned that this price control was actually requested by the private sector, it was not like a decision by the government. Of course the ultimate decision was by the government, but it was the private sector. So when your service quality is not reflected in a star system, and when you actually impose a price flow on that system, is quite sad and quite, I would say, surprising and dangerous, because it completely mixes the signals on the market system.
Can I add something to what Dhananath said? Because I think when you talk about the star classification system, it's also important to note that there is no international standard. So it's up to the country to set it, right? And like you rightfully said, the qualitative factors are not captured. And one can also make the argument that it's because how do you objectively quantify the quality of service, for example, right? So that is also there. And the other thing is also that I think the reason that this policy was brought in was because, like Dhananath said, it was brought in, you could say, from the private sector, and that's because there were allegations made that certain high-end hotels were undercutting their prices. So because of that, certain the lower grade hotels in terms of star classifications were finding it very difficult to compete based on prices. So that was also the reason given by the government for bringing this in, and that was the same reason that the government says that they implemented it from 2009 to 2019 as well.
Right. So now that we spoke about the undercutting of prices, guys, how important is competitiveness in a marketplace? And you know what? Was it really necessary for the state to get involved, at least in this instance? What are your thoughts on that, Udahiruni?
Yeah, so I think in a market system, I think the prices act essentially as a signal, right? It especially when it's set by, anyway, in any system, the price is an indicator of value, right? So if I pay $100, I should expect a service that is worth $100, right? And especially when you allow the market itself to set the prices, it will balance itself based on how much people demand for it and how much the suppliers can supply for it, right? And the issue with this particular price control in this particular industry is that they have set essentially a blanket price throughout the year for the entire industry, right? Without accounting for some of the almost say features, the particular features in the industry. For example, when it comes to tourism, you don't have consistent demand throughout the year. You have seasonal demand, and that's a known fact. And especially in Sri Lanka, your demand peaks around December and January, and it falls down between May and June, right? So when you set a blanket price, such as in the way that the government has done, it doesn't account for these demand factors. So even when there is high demand, you can't, the same price that is there when there's high demand is the same price that the hotels have to price their rooms at when there is low demand. But also without accounting for the fact that prices are also a way where you can attract demand when you don't have demand, right? So those intricate factors and also the features of the industry itself have not been considered, I would say. And I don't think the industry was also at a point where there was market failure that warranted the government to intervene as well.
What about you, Dhananath? Do you want to add on to anything?
No, I think it's important. Nothing much to add, but I think it's important that you keep the prices is a signal for the scarcity value of any good or service in the market. It's very, very important that we keep the price signaling right. It is like your thermometer. I mean, if you are having fever, you can have two options. One is maybe when you check from the thermometer, if it's too high, you can manipulate the thermometer. Right? Price ceilings is something like that. Just because you manipulate the thermometer doesn't mean that your fever is going away. It's like it's still there. The other option is you admit that the your body temperature is high and you take some medicine. So you go to the root cause of the disease and get some antibiotics or something. So that's what you need to do. So price signals are very, very important. I think what government tries to do basically is manipulating the thermometer. They just erase the first scale and then they like remark with their own scale and say, okay, like, guys, look, this is very nice. Everything is in order. Prices have come down, all good, but it doesn't work in that way.
Now, something that I read about in the Gazette, this was gazetted I think a couple of weeks ago, was that this applies solely within Colombo city limits, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that is also another key factor when considering competitiveness, because if we are cutting off just one part of Sri Lanka to, promote these prices and are stuck with these prices, what does that say about competitiveness in comparison to down south or the central or northeast? Where the hotel industry does exist in these places as well, and I'm very curious to find out what the rationale behind only the Colombo city limits were. But however, speaking of, tourism is something that is touted within Sri Lanka as a factor for bringing in foreign reserves, right, and increasing our dollar gains. How, if at all, any impact could we expect to see from policy like this? And also, I would like to pose the question of, do you think that this could be a slippery slope of where, the government starts intervening in markets in other city limits as well and getting involved there, because competitiveness is something that perhaps a lot of people can't deal with?
Yeah, so I think, okay, even if you don't look at down south, for example, or even like up country or anything, even if you just look beyond the city limits, right? Take places like Panadura, take places like Moratua. Do you not get like 5-star hotels or 4-star hotels, right? So just outside the city limit itself, you get so many hotels that would fall into this price control if they were within the city limit, right? So that's the first thing. And the other thing is also, even within the city limits, you don't just get hotels, you have other forms of accommodation. You have Airbnbs, you have guest houses, right? So does that mean that, so do you think then a tourist would be willing to pay extra and stay at a hotel when you also have alternative forms of accommodation within the city itself? And the other thing is that I think we need to realize that when it comes to tourism, we are not just competing within the country, right? We're competing with regional partners and even like other countries as well. So some of our biggest competitors are like Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, right? So what happens in a price control like this is that, for example, you can say in Sri Lanka the 5-star hotel is $100, right? But that is a price that is given by the government and not set by the hotel itself, right? So that's an outsider coming in and valuing the value of your services essentially. But then the tourists can also go to places like Thailand, where the hotels themselves price themselves at $100, for example. So that means they actually offer a value or like a service that is worth $100. And the rationale for sort of imposing price controls within just the city limits has not been provided by the government. This was the case, I think, back when the last time we implemented it as well. And even back then, a rationale was not provided. And I think Dhananath can also expand on this.
Sorry. True. And I think that it's when the Colombo city limits are given like, Bambalapitiya will fall, or like Bambalapitiya Vallavatta will fall under Colombo city limits, and like just few kilometers away, Dehivala and Mount Lavinia will not fall under that. So I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And also, I think Udahiruni knows this better. Even in terms of the attracting the revenue for a hotel, it is not basically the room rates that is attracting, but of course the restaurants, there are other lot of facilities that a hotel would provide, and those are their revenue channels. And also, even if it's in Colombo, I can't understand, because now, for example, let's say Colombo 7, a hotel in Colombo 7, of course their room rates has to be high, because Colombo 7, the land value has to be, it's obviously high, right? So your prices definitely has to be higher. And if you are somewhere in maybe Vallavatta or somewhere, somewhere else, then of course you can afford. And also depending on, even if you're at Colombo 7, if you are in some, some very obscure location, even in the Colombo city, if the ambience is not nice, if the area is not good, of course your rates has to, you cannot have the same rate. So I don't understand why people do price floors. But I think maybe what we can think is, I think since it was driven by the private sector, I think the 4-star and the 3-star guys were worried that when during off season, when the prices were brought down by the 5-star hotels, that they will not be able to compete with the rates. So that itself, I think, is an indication, the understanding of the industry, that of course the room rates may have a implication, but as a tourist, you're not only checking at the room rate, you're looking at so many other options, and also the efficiency of the one layer down. And when you have like this association, this rent seeking and all that taking place, that I think probably what may have taken place. But as we all know, the prices should indicate the value. And I think, for especially since we all want to attract tourists, how can you say like not keeping the prices down? It's like ridiculous when you look at from a tourist point of view. Like the industry is willing to bring down the rates, but government is saying no, you don't bring down the rates. You have to maintain the rate. And imagine it happens to you when you are traveling. Like you are traveling to India, and the government of India saying no, you can't bring it down further. You have to have a higher rate. And you are like, come on, what are you talking about? Like your hotel owner is willing to bring down the rate, but the government is saying no, you have to increase the rate. And it doesn't make sense.
And
Right.
if I can,
sorry,
one more thing that I want to add is that just within, even like Dana spoke about, like even within the city limits, there are so many different, like based on the geographical location, it can change, right? And I think even if you look at the end user, that is the tourist, people don't come into a country just for the same reason, right? There are different reasons for someone to visit a country. So in December, for example, last year, 55% came for just vacationing and all of that. And then around 20% came to visit their friends and family. And there were around 6% for MICE tourism as well, right? And also, so based on why you're coming into the country, and we also get backpackers, for example, right? So it's not always high-end tourism as well. So based on the reason that you're coming into the country, your spending limits will also be different, right? So if I'm coming for a budget travel, I'm not going to stay in a 5-star hotel or a 1-star hotel, for example, right? I might choose different cheaper forms of accommodation. So when you put a blanket price like this, again, you're disregarding the diversity of the tourists and their spending habits as well, right? And that's what I wanted to raise.
I think one of our viewers have succinctly described the impact of this situation, and what they say is that brand name and large hotels will benefit regardless, and reducing competitiveness from smaller providers with different experiences will only hurt the entire industry, and will affect the entire industry, and therefore it's not good for anyone, right? So I think what we can all agree is that price is king, and it should not be determined by the state, and demand and things like that are things that should be organically left to certain markets, And once that's done, I think markets will flourish on their own. And competitiveness, I think in all industries, like we said, with the SOE reforms as well, these things are very important. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I'd also like to thank Udahiruni and Dhananath for taking time off and joining me. And I hope it helped everyone understand a little bit better about the things that happen throughout the week. And I'd just like to remind everyone that this is a weekly casual chat that we like to have internally. And if the audience wants to ask us any questions on a particular topic or would like us to give our expertise or opinions, please do reach us to us throughout our social media platforms and continue to support us as you always have done.
Thank you, Akhila.
Thank you, Dhananath.
Thank you. Thank you.